As they picked him up on their shoulders and walked him out, he was one of only 2 football players to ever be walked out on shoulders in the stadium at Notre Dame. One of 2. And thank God he wasn't super huge, because you can imagine all the football players who at some point thought, how about I take my buddy out? And they go to grab him and go to pick him up and realize this is a bad idea. Because football players are big and heavy, except this guy wasn't. His name was Daniel, but you've probably heard of him as Rudy. The movie starts when he's in high school. Last day of football practice, they get to run through and tackle the coach, and everybody's ready to basically end their time. How many of you ever did anything in high school in terms of athletics or band or anything where you knew, this is kind of it for me. I'm not moving forward from here? The rest of you still think you got a shot, huh? And so he's like, no, I want to play football at Notre Dame. He only had 2 problems with that notion. The first was that he wasn't actually all that academic, and the second was that he wasn't all that good at football. It didn't matter because he had a dream. He would sit on the weekends with his dad and they would watch the game. And so his buddy bought him a Notre Dame jacket. He even went to the stadium and walked through it and said, this is where I'm going to be. But it turns out that's not where he was, right? He was at a junior college close by, and he applied to the University of Notre Dame several times. He just applied and was rejected, and applied and was rejected, and applied and was rejected. And some of you are thinking, I hope to God we didn't fly this guy from California just to tell us the plot of Rudy. But every time I watch the movie, and I've seen it tons of times. When the movie came out, it wasn't that big of a hit, and yet now it's in the top 25 motivational sports movies ever. And every time we get to the part where he's playing, in the real life, he got 3 plays on the field. In the movie, he gets 2. But that last play, he runs past the front line and tackles. He gets an actual sack. It's in the books. He sacks the quarterback. And every time I feel my throat get super tight, my eyes get a little bit misty, it gets dusty in my office, my bedroom or my living room, and I'm like, how is it possible that I've seen this movie like 20 times and it still happens? Turns out it's not because of Rudy. It's because of these guys. If you've seen the movie, you know that his dad basically thought he was crazy to suggest that he'd ever play. And his brother thought he was a liar. If you haven't seen the movie, right, the non-spoiler notion is that it's great I'm telling you the non-spoiler version when I already told you they take him out on the field and he gets the last sack. But anyway, he gets put onto the team. He eventually gets into Notre Dame. He gets put on the team, but he's on the practice team. The kids that you crush when you're on the main team during practice. And he tells his brother, hey, I'm on the team. And they're like, you know what? You're a liar. Because I've never seen you on game day, never seen you on TV, never seen you in a uniform. I don't believe you. And yet, on the day that he's dressed out, on the day that he goes out onto the field with the team, his brother and his father are there. And I get all choked up because I'm like, oh my God, they get to see it. They get to witness a moment that this kid has worked so hard for, that he wasn't lying. And the transformation that's happening isn't just for him. The transformation is also for them. Does that make sense? When it comes to stories, the compelling story, the notion of a really good story, is that it transforms people. And it's not just the transformation that happens internally, it's the transformation of everybody that comes in contact with a story. This morning, I want to talk to you about stories. So let me tell you a little about mine. This is me and my brother. One of the first shots I think we have. I'm that guy on the left. I still am 15 months older than my little brother. The reason I'm 15 months older than my little brother is because I was born 3 months premature. And when you're born 3 months premature in 1970, you have a 50-50 shot of surviving and almost 100% shot of being brain damaged. And so the doctors approached my mom and said, if you want a normal, healthy child, you need to get pregnant right away. And so my brother is 15 months younger than me because they weren't sure I was going to make it. And yet, as the older brother, the story in my house was really easy to understand. The story was, you got to take care of your brother. You got to love your brother. You got to protect your brother. One time, my brother went to eat a peanut, and he choked on it. And somehow my parents yelled at me. Like, why are you yelling at me? I didn't eat the peanut. They're like, but he's choking on the peanut, and you shouldn't be laughing. You should tell us. And I'm like, well, I just can't. He's like, oh, I'm like, that's funny. Look at his funny face, right? But no, my job, the story was, you take care of your brother. As we got a little older, now I don't know if you can tell, but that fashion wasn't just me being crazy. Even in the NBA, people were wearing super short shorts and long socks up to their knees. So that was just kind of the fashion in those days. You got to trust me. But the notion was, still, you take care of your little brother. So if there was a problem at school, if there was a fight, if there was something else, big brother was supposed to be there for my little brother. And then something changed. It was at the dinner table. My dad's an engineer. And so my dad, for fun at dinner, some of you are going to love this. The rest of us know that it's torture. My dad would say things like, what's the square root of 732? There's some of you right now who are trying to figure it out in your head. I hate you. For me, I'd be like, okay, you can do this math with me. 30 times 30 is 900. I got that one. It's less than 30. 20 times 20 is 400. It's more than that. So it's somewhere between 20 and 30, and that's where my brain stopped. I was no longer interested. The puzzle wasn't entertaining, and so I would do things like 22, 24, 27, did I get it? My brother would just work a little bit long and then just say, oh, and he'd give out, and he wouldn't, because he's such a jerk, right? He wouldn't just say like, it's 26, he'd say it's 26.27 or whatever it is, right? And my dad would be like, well, it's 27.28, but you're pretty close, that's a good job. You want another one? And my brother's like, yeah, and I'm like, no. No, I have no interest in doing this. And yet my dad would continue to do just math problems at the table. And somewhere in that period, around junior high, the story shifted in our house. My brother was the smart one. That was his label. Not just a label that was given to him in the house, not just a label that was articulated by my dad at home at the dinner table. That was the articulation for the world to know. My brother was the smart one. I was the hard worker. Chris works hard. Joey, later Jose, he was the smart one. And there's a part of you that goes, that's just so wrong. To tell the older brother that at least you work hard. Right? That's not exactly what you want to hear. Well, but Chris works hard. Joey's the smart one, right? Because he could do 3-digit multiplication at the dinner table. Nowadays, I'm like, hey, bro, how's that working out for you? But hey, that's a whole different story. It turns out that years ago, a woman named Carol Dweck did some research at Columbia University with some young children, and then she turned around and replicated it at Stanford. She did it with young children, she did it with junior hires, she did it with high schoolers, and even with college folks. And the way the research worked, they set up 2 rooms. The rooms were identical, 2 tables, chairs on either side, proctors on both sides of the tables in both rooms, and they would bring these students in to sit down at the table. And they had scripts that the proctors would read. They were exactly identical except for one thing. They would put a puzzle in front of someone and say, here's a puzzle, and then the kids would work on the puzzle. The puzzle would get solved because it was pretty easy. And when the puzzle was solved, they looked at the script and they said almost the exact same thing. In the one room, they said, wow, you're really smart. I have another puzzle. It's a little harder. I'm not sure if you'll solve it, but would you like to try it? And in the other room, they said, wow, I can see you worked hard. I have another puzzle. It's a little bit harder. I'm not sure you'd solve it. Would you like to try it? And what's amazing is that over 70% of the time, and it didn't matter if you were on the East Coast or the West Coast, didn't matter how old you were, over 70% of the time, the people who were praised for hard work said, sure, I'll try another puzzle. And the people who were praised for their intelligence said, no thanks. Because as Carol Dweck discovered, much like it was in the Lemma family, in the Lemma family, if you were praised for being smart, you only wanted to do the things that you knew you could do. The story that you got put into was anything we've already declared that you know, anything you've mastered, you stay there because you look smart. But in the places where you don't know how it's going to go, you may want to steer clear in case you look dumb. And in the Lemma family, if you worked hard, you're like, I'll just give it a shot. What's the worst that can happen? I just put a little bit more elbow grease into it. I just put a little more work into it, but I can do that because I'm the hard worker. Carol Dweck figured out, you know what? It's called a growth mindset. When you praise children for their effort, they're like, oh, okay, I can do this. And it encourages risk-taking. It won't be a surprise to you when I tell you that when I graduated college, I went and joined a startup, and then I did another startup, and then I did another startup, and 5 startups later, I had spent a decade of my life where I never knew if we had enough money in the bank to go past 3 months. And I lived with that reality for 10 years and didn't really freak out because what's the worst that can happen? Something just falls apart, the company goes down, and you just start another one and you just keep trying. It's all about hard work. There's no problem. I can take the risk. Are you catching what I'm throwing? My son likes to say, I'm picking up what you're laying down. So then we get really cool and techie in our house. I'm like, well, are you footnoting what I'm citing? Yeah, we're geeks at home. You see, what I'm telling you is that for some people, the story that you find yourself in starts to sound a bit like a dud, and you have the choice. It's your choice to decide how you embrace that story and what you make of it. What I want to introduce you to this morning is what I call the story curve. And it's all about impact. And I'll explain why I'm spending so much time talking about stories in just a second. But first, let me show you the curve. If you look over here on my left, or on your left, you see the signs early in life of someone who has something compelling, some giftedness, some accelerated ability, and you think, wow, they're pretty good at that. It's my fundamental belief that every single person on the planet is a little bit better than some other people in some realm. It starts early. You have some capability, some approach, some way of thinking, some way of acting, some way of moving that puts you a little bit ahead of some others. And yet half the time, we don't get very far with it. Because what happens is life intrudes. And when life intrudes, we get all sorts of challenges. And at that inflection point, we've seen what happens, right? At that inflection point, when life's challenges hit, some people just turn victim. You've met them. The people who are telling you about the dodgeball incident that ruined their knee in junior high, which is why their football career ended, or their gymnast career ended, or whatever career ended. And you're like, dude, that was junior high. Like, are we seriously talking about dodgeball? And yet it happens. Because some people, life's challenge hits, and that's where the curve ends. And they're just stuck there. Nothing else happens. Have you heard of Nelson Mandela? If you don't know the backstory, Nelson Mandela was a rebel. He had a gun. He shot and killed people. He was, you might call, one of the bad guys. It all depends on how you write history, but he's walking around with a gun. He's shooting people. They put him in jail. And whether you understand the politics in South Africa, and whether you understand whether he was a good guy or bad guy, and whatever else it is, I think we can all agree that if you find yourself in jail, it's easy to say, my story's done. It's easy to say, this is just where it ends. And if you sat in jail as long as Nelson Mandela, boy, that becomes a really easy play. And yet, he took that story, embraced it, and at several different points when people were like, hey, do you want to come out of jail? Like, you want to come out? He's like, oh, no. I'm not leaving until these things happen. And at a mature age, when he finally stepped out of prison, he went on to lead the country. There are people who take life's challenges and say, okay, I'm just going to make that part of my story. I'm going to make it part of the story. I'm going to embrace it. And you end with impact and influence. I don't think that you can have the impact you want or the impact that you ought to have until you learn your own story. Until you embrace your own story. Whether you're a freelancer, whether you're an individual who's working as part of a company, whether you're the CEO of your own company, unless you know your story, unless you understand it and embrace it, I don't think you'll have real impact. That's my take. When I was in high school, a group of us, we all played on the soccer team. We thought we were cool. We decided that we would go to a basketball game and just cheer on from the bleachers. But we were obnoxious high schoolers, right? So if we scored a point, what did we do? This is the interactive part where you say you cheered. Yeah, because I just told you that. See how I led with that? When we scored a point, what do you think we did? Cheer. That's right. When we missed the basket, what do you think we did? Cheer. Yeah, we did. When the ref called us for a foul, what do you think we did? Cheer. Yeah. All we did was we cheered for everything. They're like, substitution, we're like, yes! Yes, we're so good at that. And they're like, who invited these idiots? We cheered and cheered and cheered And that was fun until the next day. Because I got to school, and unless you have some sort of virus, most of the time laryngitis is caused by the overuse of the muscles in your throat. And I got laryngitis. I couldn't speak. And if you want to try and imagine a lemma who can't speak, that's just irony wrapped up in a ball, gift wrapped, and handed to a high school teacher who's like, we're having a discussion, Mr. Lemma, what do you... Okay, this is going to be a fun period, right? I don't know, what do you think Mr. Lemma thinks, right? No, I can't. Oh, they had a lot of fun at my expense. I couldn't speak. Have any of you had laryngitis ever? Right? Some form of, I lost my voice. How many of you thought it was fun? There's always one of you. How many of you would ever do it on your own? No. We don't ever try and lose our voice on purpose. Yet if you don't know your story, if you haven't embraced your story, that's exactly what you're doing. You're silencing yourself. Does that make sense? Yeah? It's what you're doing. It doesn't make any sense. My story, at the core of it, I use the notion of a puzzle as a metaphor. It's really easy. It turns out, I believe, personally, that every single person has some sort of skill. They have some sort of unique experience. They have the background to be able to do something that many other people can't do. Imagine that as a puzzle piece. And I believe each one of you has a puzzle piece, but most of you have it stuck in your pocket. And you don't play the piece because there's some voice on your shoulder telling you that piece isn't all that original. That piece isn't all that special. It's not that big a deal. Someone else will play their piece. And so you've listened to that voice long enough that you don't know your story, you haven't embraced your story, and so that piece is sitting in your pocket. And I get to meet people every day. And as I meet them and I listen to what's going on, as I ask for their story and as I pull it out, I'm just pretty good at figuring out the puzzle piece and figuring out how to get it played. And so my job is to encourage, my goal is to encourage you to play your piece, to assemble. I was one of those guys in high school and in college that wasn't the smartest guy at all. Remember, that was my brother. But I was the guy who could assemble people together and go, you'd be pretty good at that, you'd be pretty good at that, why don't we do this? Not lording it over them, not trying to be their boss, but simply as a, let's assemble and get everybody playing their piece and see what comes up. And our team and our projects would win. And so that's what I do every day. Yeah, I manage software developers, but my job is to get people to put their piece on the board. Because if you've ever built a puzzle, when you're mostly close to done, and there's a couple pieces missing, it's just a frustrating dynamic. Because you know someone has a piece. You know the piece is somewhere. But someone has decided, because of the voice on their shoulder, to leave it in their pocket. But you know, this morning isn't about me. This morning's about you. My job this morning is to make sure that you're awake and prepared for all the rest of the event today. And I want to ask you what your story is. What I want to do is give you a couple templates to figure it out. Now, this is secret stuff. But for you, I want to share it because too many people go, I don't really know what my story is. So I want you to imagine for just a second that you're with me and we're walking onto a path. We're heading somewhere. We're trying to get someplace special. And whatever else that place is, whatever it means to us or represents, we're trying to get there, a physical location. We're on the path to it, and yet we're stuck because of a river. A river that's pretty wide and pretty deep. And so our first take is, I'll just cross the river. And so what do? We take a step into the river. We don't mind getting a little bit wet, but we drop so deep so fast that we realize this is not going to work, and we back up out of the river. We think that's okay. I'm going to swim across the river. I'll get more momentum that way. And so we dive into the river and we start swimming, but midstream, midway across, the current is strong. And we start getting moved half a mile down the riverbed, and we go, oh, this is not going to work. We pull back, walk half a mile back up to the path, and sit there wondering how we're going to get across the river. Then a boat comes by, and we pull up the cash we have, and we're like, hey, could I buy my way across the river? And people are like, great, they take the money and they take off. And you're sitting there wet and poor, looking at this river and wondering how you're ever going to get to the spot that you need to go to. And so in your frustration, you start walking down the river. You're walking on the riverbank, and you walk for maybe 2 miles. And you get 2 miles down. You're not actually looking for anything when you find the bridge that goes right across the river. And you step across the bridge, you get to the other side, and you walk 2 miles back up to the path. And before you turn to head down the path, you look back, and there's a group of people standing at the path on the other side of the river, trying to get to the very same place you're headed to. And not because you're a superstar, and not because you're an expert, not because you're a guru of any sort, at that moment, you can predict everything they're about to go through, can't you? Or you know what they're going to try, and you know where things are going to fail, and you know what's going to be hard, but you also know where the bridge is. And so you decide to turn back and yell across the river. Head down 2 miles down. There's a bridge. It'll bring you right over. The formula is really simple. I help people who are trying to blank because I have blank. Oh, there are people trying to get over the river, and I help them because I've been there before, and I've tried to step across the river. I've tried to swim across the river. I've tried to buy my way across the river, and I know where the bridge is at. So I can help you. I don't know what the river is. I don't know what the destination is, but I can tell you that this formula is incredibly powerful. Each of you have had hurdles you've had to cross. Each of you have had sticking points. How many of you have used WordPress for more than 5 minutes? Okay, that's all. That's good. That's pretty much most of you. How many of you, the first time you went to log into WordPress, you got a little stuck? It's okay to raise your hand. Not all of us are born knowing WP-login or WP-admin. Or login.php. These are not things that come naturally to us, and so what happens? We've all hit a stumbling block and then figured out how to get past it. There are people who are still stuck right there, staring at a website someone made them and going, I don't know how to get back to whatever they showed me on that video call. And you're like, oh, I don't know much about WordPress, but it turns out you know something. And you're like, oh, I've been there. I know how hard it is to get over that. I can help you with that. The formula is powerful because of your own experience, not because of the magic words on the screen. Does that make sense? My dad was a soccer coach for years. And for years I played soccer growing up, all the way through high school and into the first couple years of college. And I loved soccer. My dad, this is in the old days, where only first place and second place got trophies. A couple years ago, we enrolled my son into a soccer league in the winter where it was explicitly a no-trophy league, just play. No practices, no trophies, just play. And the parents got so upset that they made a collection of money so that they could buy trophies for all the kids. And I'm like, it's a no trophy. They're like, these kids deserve trophies. I could talk for 45 minutes on that, but let's just move on. In the old days, there were trophies for first and second place. And my dad got us to that game pretty much every year. They would say, well, Coach Lemma always gets the best kids. But the truth is, if you knew the kids at the beginning of the season, they were horrible. But Coach Lemma could get pretty much any group to work together as a team and get themselves to the big game. We didn't always win first place, but we were there pretty much all the time. Except when I was 5. Turns out my dad's skills didn't translate to kids who were 5. At halftime, we would sit on the field in a semicircle, eating our orange wedges and having our little Dixie cup of Gatorade, and my dad would be there talking about Pelé and talking about the Brazilian soccer team and the Chilean soccer team and skills and practice and what we have to do to spread open the field at 5. And what we were doing is every time he turned somewhere and he was animated, moving his hands, we would pick up grass and drop it in the Dixie cup. Everybody was putting grass in the Dixie cup till he went to get a drink and he's like, what? And we were like, yeah, we weren't listening to anything you said. So he stopped coaching 5-year-olds. But as he coached the rest of us, he consistently transformed a group of kids into a winning team. Maybe that's your background. I turned blank into blank by doing this and this. For me, for the longest time, I turned everyday people into entrepreneurs by helping them anticipate the challenges that they were going to face and helping them accelerate through it. I'd done 5 startups. I'd raised millions of dollars. I'd lost millions of dollars. I'd rolled out product. I'd launched products. I could sit there and say, I know exactly what you're going through. I know what you're going to hit. I know what the challenges are. I can help you. And I can turn everyday people into entrepreneurs. It's not that hard. Here's what it's going to take. Why do we talk so much about stories? Because ultimately, stories help everybody understand where they fit and how the transformation is going to work. They manage expectations. If I were walking up to an entrepreneur and say, I can turn you into an entrepreneur, but here's what it's going to take. In that story, if I start telling them the story of how it's working, well, let me just ask you this. Have you ever been on a call with a client where they want to know the price of something? How many of you just give them a price? It's okay to raise your hand. And they say, what's the price? And then you give them a price. That's what most people do. Right? Yeah, okay. The rest of you are liars. That's okay. We're not in a church. How many of you tell them a story about another project? Some of you? Yeah. Because you know what happens when you do that? You get to anchor them. Oh, I did a project just like this, blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously it wasn't exactly like your project, but blah, blah, blah. But it was $8,000, blah, blah, blah. And you keep talking past the $8,000, but what have you done? You just dropped that little nugget for them. And they were like, oh my God, I was totally thinking 1,500. And he just said 8,000, but guess what? Now when you come back, well, yours aren't exactly alike, but if we cut this and that, we can probably get it for 5,000. And they're like, oh, thank God he didn't say 8,000. And you're like, oh my God! Can a story really do that? Yes, stories help everybody understand where they fit and manage the expectations. Some of you are like, okay, but seriously, I don't have a riverbank story, and I'm not a coach that transforms winners. I can't do this. Well, let me tell you one more story. A guy who wears one of these uniforms. I don't know how you feel about cops. Maybe you think cops are like the greatest thing ever, or maybe you think they're total jerks. It doesn't matter. Because in California, the California Highway Patrol consistently can ruin anyone's day. They can pull you over, and right when they start, you're in a bad mood. The car says to protect and serve, and you're like, you're a liar. You're a modern day tax collector who comes in and takes my money because you hide behind a big tree and you wait for me to go down that downhill curve and you know I'm going to speed and you pull me over and you're laughing. I know you're laughing inside. And so CHP can pull you over and you can just start a very unhappy part of your day. Except for a guy named Elton. Elton has worked in Los Angeles for more than 20 years. He has handed out 25,000 traffic citations. 25,000. And do you know how many complaints he has? 0. It is a statistical anomaly that the sheriff's office couldn't comprehend. Tons of citations, yet every other CHP guy in California gets 1, 2, if not 3 or more complaints a year. And Elton, for more than 20 years, has handed people over 25,000 citations and never once had a complaint filed against him. And you go, wow, that is incredible. It's only a compelling story at the end of 25 years, right? And yet you're like, that's amazing. So CBS took a crew out and they followed him, right? And they shot video and they watched how he worked and they interviewed him. And the people, I'm not lying, you can find it online, right? The people were interviewed after they got a ticket and they're laughing and smiling and you're like, that's insane. I have never laughed when I've gotten a ticket. But when they interview him, he's like, well, most people, I hate being talked down to, so I don't ever talk down. So I'm not here and they're here. I'm right here with them. Maybe you don't have a fancy story, right? But maybe your story is, look, every single day I do blank. And I do it this way so that these people can do this stuff. Every day I do this. And I do it so that these people can enjoy this stuff. It may not be compelling in that single instance, and yet the cumulative total of your efforts can be incredible as a story. Are you a coach? No, I'm not much of a coach. Well, are you a counselor? Do you connect people? What are the things you do? The verbs of your life tell the story that can have impact on the world around you. But when I showed you this curve, right, I told you the top part of it is all about impact and influence, right? I said, hey, it's all about transformation. And it's not just transformation for you, it's transformation for everybody that comes in contact with the story. These are some of my friends. They're here today. And if you want to hear the most incredible story of a newspaper guy who decided, without much technical skill, to start a little company that would then make sure that all his employees consistently had work, and that they're one of the longest running companies in the WordPress ecosystem. Oh man, he's here today. You can ask him his story. You can hear the transformation in his own life, but also in the lives of all of his employees. You might meet his COO, who in any other world you'd be like, but he's a child. He's a young man. You'd like him because he hunts. You'd like him because he drinks strong drink. I like him because of all the work he's done that puts him in a class above everybody else. Oh, there's a guy in here who's worked with movie studios and built all sorts of amazing stuff, and you're like, I didn't even know that was possible. He's kind of a rock star. He puts his pants on one leg at a time like everybody else. There's a former nurse in this room who has written consistently a book that gets a new edition after a new edition after a new edition that brings tens of thousands of people a year into the WordPress ecosystem because they're not afraid to buy a dummies book and learn WordPress. I could go for 45 more minutes about every single person in this room that I know, and I don't know all of you. But the stories aren't just personal stories. They're not just internal stories. They're compelling because they've transformed the world around them. And you're in the same room with them today. And you have your own story. If you don't know their story, I want to encourage you to find someone. You could walk up to every single person today and be like, are you the newspaper guy who transformed? But better yet, walk up to someone and just ask them their story. Because the stories you hear, the relationships that you make, will outpace all the rest of the classes that you sit in today. Now, that's not to say the classes aren't awesome. They are. But the stories from the people are more awesome. Do not hide. Many of you, this is your first event. Do not hide. Don't go into a classroom, sit down, and just listen over and over and over without talking to anyone. If you walk in today and you hang out today and you depart today and you haven't talked to anyone, you failed. I said it. Because the people in this room have some of the most compelling stories ever. I don't know where you're at today. Maybe for you, the biggest question is just what's your story? Maybe you have to figure out your story. Maybe in the back of your head, you know a bit of your story, but you're not ready to embrace it. You haven't learned how to tell it. Or maybe for too long, your story's just been about you, and you have forgotten that there's all sorts of people around you that need to hear and be transformed by your story. When I started working with WordPress, I did all the things you're not supposed to do. Like all of them. And I found out, sometimes in really simple ways and sometimes in really not so simple ways, that I'd done it wrong. I hate when people say you're doing it wrong. I like when they say it, though, in private. Right? Nobody wants to get on public Twitter and be told, like, yeah, that was wrong. And you're like, oh, thank you for that. I really appreciate that you told me and 10,000 followers. I don't know where you're at with your story, but I can tell you this. I've made tons of mistakes. Thankfully, my story is all about just working hard to get past them. And it takes no particular skill to do that. Today, learn as much as you can, take in as much as you can, and get to know as many people as you can. Hear their story and hopefully be transformed by it. And you will walk out today far richer than the money you spent to be here. My name's Chris Lemma. I'm more of a hard worker than a smart guy. I spend my days assembling puzzle pieces on to ensure that people can do some of the best work of their life. And the photo of me today puts me here as a CTO of a company called Crowd Favorite. Thank you very much.